Well, today we're diving headfirst into some pretty bleak territory.
Really venturing into the abyss this time.
Yeah, base materialism and its strange connection to Gnosticism.
Not exactly light dinner conversation.
Definitely not. We're dissecting this text, and let me tell you, it doesn't exactly offer a lot of comfort.
It doesn't pull any punches, that's for sure.
Right off the bat, it challenges a distinction we usually take for granted. Matter versus form.
Yeah, Bataille argues that while that difference seems clear enough when you're looking at, I don't know, like this coffee cup, right? The cup is a form, distinct from the ceramic material.
Makes sense.
But when you try to think about everything all at once, that distinction sort of falls apart.
So when we talk about matter in this total sense.
Exactly. It's just an abstraction. As meaningless as any other big, sweeping concept, the text actually compares it to the word God.
Because they're both constructs.
Yeah.
Trying to impose order on something that fundamentally can't be categorized.
Exactly. Prison walls for thought, the text calls them. Creating an illusion of meaning where, honestly, there might be nothing.
This whole prison walls metaphor, it's interesting. The text then goes on to talk about metaphysical escapism, this human need to build these intricate thought systems that promise to transcend the material world.
And it suggests that this impulse, it might come from a deep-seated discomfort with, well, just existing, with the material reality of our lives. Like we're driven to find meaning, even if it's all a bunch of bunk, even if it means building castles in the sky, as they say.
So all attempts to find meaning are inherently futile. Even, the text seems particularly critical of dialectical materialism.
Right. Even with its emphasis on contradiction and change and all that, it's still, according to this text at least, it's still stuck within the limits of language and traditional categories, still trying to grasp everything with tools that just aren't up to the job.
Which brings us to this idea of, and I'll be honest, even after reading this text a few times, I'm still kind of struggling with it, but this idea of a base materialism.
Yeah, it's a slippery one, that's for sure. Not just about, saying the material world is more important than the spiritual or whatever. It's more like confronting the rawness of existence without trying to impose order, without trying to make it make sense.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it, but how do we even wrap our heads around that? The text points to Gnosticism, which seems, I don't know, like a weird connection to make.
It does and it doesn't. Remember, the Gnostics, they believed the material world was inherently flawed.
Right.
Like a cosmic prison built by some lesser deity.
Right, a far cry from your typical image of materialism.
Exactly. But the connection, it's in their shared rejection of all the traditional metaphysical frameworks. Both base materialism and Gnosticism, each in their own way, they challenge the idea that we can truly understand reality through reason, through revelation, anything like that.
So it's not about the specific beliefs so much as it's about this underlying skepticism.
Yeah.
This refusal to accept the grand narratives, whether they're religious, philosophical, whatever.
Precisely. And get this, to illustrate this point, the text brings up these things called Abraxas stones.
Abraxas stones?
Yeah, these artifacts, a lot of them are from the 3rd or 4th century, and they often depict this, this deity, Abraxas, usually shown as this chimeric figure, rooster head, human body, snakes for legs, the whole 9 yards.
Snakes for legs, that's a choice.
It is. And it gets weirder. He's often shown with other figures, Egyptian deities sometimes, like Anubis.
So you've got this fusion of Greek and Egyptian elements. What's the significance there?
I think it points to the syncretic nature of Gnostic thought. Their willingness to draw from all over the place, even if the pieces contradict. It's almost as if they were trying to give form to something that inherently resists being formed.
Something inherently unintelligible, as the text puts it.
Exactly. And that's key here. The text argues that maybe this need we have to make things intelligible, to impose order and meaning, maybe that's exactly what's stopping us from seeing reality for what it really is.
Which brings us back to base materialism. It embraces the unintelligibility, the lack of inherent meaning.
Precisely. And that's where things start to get really unsettling, because it makes you face the possibility that there is no inherent meaning, no preordained order, no escape from the meaninglessness of our material existence.
Interesting you use the word escape again, because it seems like traditional metaphysics and this base materialism, even though they're positioned as opposites, they both keep circling back to this idea of confinement.
Yes. And that might be the most unsettling realization of all. Maybe true freedom isn't about transcending our limits or even imposing order on them, but about inhabiting them fully, confronting the utter contingency, even the absurdity of our existence without the comfort of illusions.
So where does that leave us? What are we left with if not for these systems of meaning we've built for ourselves?
Perhaps a kind of radical uncertainty, a recognition that our attempts to grasp it all, to find comfort in the grand narratives, might just be futile. Maybe the most honest approach is to sit with the discomfort, acknowledge the limits of what we can comprehend, resist the urge to fill the void with comforting fictions.
Well, even for us, that's a pretty bleak outlook.
Bleak, sure, but maybe strangely liberating too. If there's no inherent meaning, no set path, then perhaps we have this terrifying freedom to create our own meaning, embrace the absurdity, forge our own path through this chaotic, indifferent universe.
You say freedom, but it sounds like a terrifying kind of freedom. The weight of infinite possibility, but without a compass of predetermined meaning.
Indeed. And that tension, that burden of freedom within confinement, that just might be the defining characteristic of the human condition.
So if we accept that we're essentially adrift in a meaningless universe, how do we even begin to live? It's almost paralyzing.
That's the question, isn't it? And maybe there's no one answer, no nice and neat roadmap. But maybe that's where the Gnostics, for all their, let's say, mystical leanings, maybe they offer a strange sort of guidance.
Okay, I'm curious. How so?
They recognize the material world as a trap, right? A realm of suffering and illusion. But instead of seeking comfort in traditional religion, they emphasized individual gnosis, a direct experiential knowledge of the divine spark hidden inside us.
So a kind of inner liberation, even within the confines of a meaningless existence.
Precisely. It's not about escaping the material world, but about recognizing the illusory nature of how we perceive reality.
Which, if we're connecting this back to base materialism, might mean embracing those raw, even horrifying aspects of existence head-on, not shying away from them, not seeking refuge in those comforting illusions.
Exactly. It's a difficult path, that's for sure. But maybe when you're standing on the edge of the abyss, it's the only honest one. To stare into that void and find, maybe not meaning, but the raw, unvarnished truth of our own existence.
That's a lot to grapple with. And I think that's where this deep dive leaves us grappling with those unsettling ideas, with the possibility that our search for meaning might be a kind of, well, cosmic wild goose chase.
And maybe, just maybe, in that very act of grappling, of confronting the sheer absurdity of it all, we stumble upon something. Maybe not truth, but a kind of terrible, awe-inspiring beauty.
A beauty born of despair, you might say.
Indeed. The beauty of a universe that's completely indifferent to our hopes and dreams, a universe that demands nothing of us, but also offers this terrifying, exhilarating freedom. The freedom to create, to destroy, and to define our own existence in the face of oblivion.
It's a profound, if unsettling, thought to end on. But I think we've only scratched the surface of this dense, challenging text. Let's take a moment to delve a bit deeper into this idea of base materialism and how it might relate to the Abraxas stones. We'll pick up there when we return.
Yeah, let's dig into that. So base materialism, Abraxas stones. And again, it's not about, worshiping these stones or even buying into Gnosticism wholesale. It's about what they represent.
This defiance of easy categorization.
Exactly. You've got a Abraxas rooster head on a human body, snakes for legs, hanging out with Egyptian gods. It's a deliberate mashup, a way of breaking down the boundaries. Not about creating some new belief system, but more like taking a sledgehammer to the ones we already have.
Shattering those prison walls of thought, as the text called them.
Right, and that's where base materialism comes in.
Right.
It's not about finding the answers, but about sitting with the very unsettling realization that the questions themselves might be, well, meaningless.
We keep coming back to this idea of meaninglessness. Like, is that really all there is? Just this chaotic universe that doesn't care if we exist or not? It's a tough pill to swallow,
It is, but maybe that's the point. Maybe true freedom, if there is such a thing, comes from facing that void without flinching, without trying to fill it up with all those comforting illusions we cling to.
So how do you live with that kind of freedom? It sounds almost paralyzing, nihilistic even.
Perhaps. Or maybe it's the only way to really exist authentically. And this might seem like a strange place to bring them up again, but think about the Gnostics. For all their mysticism, they were really onto something with this whole material world as a trap idea.
But they weren't looking for escape in the usual religious sense, were they?
No, instead of looking outward, they stressed individual gnosis, that direct, unmediated experience of, well, they called it the divine spark within.
You're talking about some kind of inner liberation, Even if the universe is meaningless, even if we're trapped here.
Precisely. It's not about escaping the material world, but recognizing that the idea of escape, the idea of inherent meaning, it's all an illusion.
And base materialism is a way of seeing through those illusions, to really confront the raw, unpleasant reality of our situation.
Exactly. It's about peeling back the layers of meaning, the stories we tell ourselves, and facing that abyss head on.
You keep talking about peeling back layers, which is interesting because the Abraxas stones, with all those symbols and figures all jumbled together, they seem to be doing the opposite. Like they're adding layers, building up this chaotic tapestry of meaning.
That's a really astute observation, and I think that's precisely where their brilliance lies. They're not trying to establish some new unified belief system. They're highlighting the absurdity of trying to do that at all. They're a visual representation of the inherent chaos, the unintelligibility of, well, of everything.
So they're not meant to be understood in a traditional sense.
Not at all. They're meant to provoke, to unsettle, to make us confront the limits of what we can ever hope to understand.
Which in a roundabout way brings us back to base materialism. It's not about getting answers, it's about learning to live with the questions.
More than that, even. It's about learning to live with the possibility that the questions themselves might be utterly meaningless.
It's a lot. This idea that even our most basic assumptions about the world, about meaning, purpose, it might all be a comforting fairy tale.
And yet here we are, grappling with these very unsettling ideas. And maybe, just maybe, in that struggle, in confronting the absurdity of it all, we find, well, I hesitate to even say meaning, but maybe a certain weightiness to existence, a certain gravitas.
A weight born of despair, perhaps.
Perhaps, or a weight that comes from recognizing that we're truly free. Free to create our own meaning, even in the face of a meaningless universe.
That's a pretty radical notion, finding freedom in the acceptance of meaninglessness.
It is, but maybe it's the only kind of freedom that actually matters.
We are definitely in deep waters here. I can feel myself reaching for the life preserver of traditional philosophy, grasping for something familiar. But let's resist that urge just for a little while longer and sit with the discomfort. Let's talk about what this individual gnosis might actually look like, this direct experience of, well, you called it the divine spark, and how that might or might not connect with base materialism. It's a slippery concept, this gnosis. Almost sounds comforting, spiritual even. I'm not sure how that squares with all this bleak materialism we've been talking about.
It's not about comfort. And the divine spark, whatever the Gnostics meant by that, it wasn't about some benevolent deity up in the clouds. It was about recognizing a kind of fundamental power within the self, a capacity for, let's say, awareness that transcends the limits of, well, of our programmed reality.
So when you say transcendence here, you're not talking about escaping the material world.
Ooh, no. It's about seeing through the illusion of escape. The illusion of meaning, even, recognizing the emptiness of those constructs. And in that emptiness, maybe, just maybe, finding a strange sort of liberation.
Freedom in emptiness.
Yeah.
That feels, well, it feels like a contradiction. How do you even wrap your head around that?
It is a difficult concept because it requires a real shift in how we see things. We're conditioned to look for meaning, to create narratives that make our lives seem, I don't know, purposeful, base materialism. And I think this Gnostic idea of gnosis, too, they're asking us to give up that search.
What happens when we do? What's left when we move beyond meaning, beyond narrative? What do we find there?
Perhaps. Ourselves. Not the selves we've constructed, with language and social programming and all that, but something rawer, more fundamental.
It's like you're suggesting that real self-discovery can only happen once we strip away all the external layers of meaning.
Yeah.
Everything we use to define who we think we are.
Exactly. And that can be terrifying. Because it means accepting the possibility that there is no inherent self to discover, no predetermined essence.
So we're left with, what? An existential blank slate.
Or maybe a canvas, a chaotic, always shifting landscape of experience. And we're free to navigate that landscape, to shape it, to be shaped by it.
That's a lot of responsibility, isn't it?
Yeah.
Creating meaning in a meaningless universe, it feels almost, I don't know, godlike.
Or maybe monstrous. Don't forget, the Gnostics saw their creator deity, the demiurge, as a deeply flawed being, a cosmic blunderer even. To embrace this radical freedom, this gnosis, it's to risk becoming like that demiurge, creator of flawed, ultimately meaningless worlds.
So are we stuck between a rock and a hard place here? Either embrace comforting illusions or become these monstrous gods of our own making? Is there no middle ground?
Perhaps not. Maybe that's the terrible beauty of this realization. We're always on edge, teetering between delusion and despair.
Bleak, but there's a certain honesty to it.
Honesty, yes. And maybe, just maybe, in that honesty, there's a glimmer of something true. Not the comforting, absolute truth that philosophy has always been after, but a truth that's raw, fragmented, that reflects the chaotic, ultimately meaningless nature of existence itself.
We've covered a lot of ground, and I have to say, it leaves you in a strange place. Standing at the edge of everything we thought we knew, staring into that abyss of meaninglessness, all those comforting stories we tell ourselves, they crumble in the face of this base materialism, this Gnostic gnosis.
And yet here we are, still questioning, still grappling, still searching. Maybe that's the most human impulse of all this desperate, even if it's futile, search for meaning in a universe that doesn't offer any.
A universe that just stares back at us with this chilling indifference. And maybe the most unsettling realization of all is that, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter. Our search for meaning, our struggles, our triumphs, it's all for nothing.
And yet it's all we have. That's the paradox, isn't it? We know deep down that our existence is finite, absurd, ultimately meaningless. And yet we're compelled to live, to create, to claw our way towards some semblance of meaning, even in the face of oblivion.
It's a profound, if utterly terrifying thought to end on. But I think we've reached the bottom of this particular abyss for today. No easy answers here, no comforting platitudes, just the cold, hard truth of our own insignificance.